Most people who are trying to eat healthy have already swapped out their candy bar for dark chocolate. They read the label, 70% cacao, and they think they're done. Good choice made. But here's what nobody's telling them. That bar sitting on the shelf went through a roasting process that reached temperatures between 130 and 150 degrees C. And at those temperatures, the specific compound responsible for what I'm about to show you, it's mostly gone. Up to 80% of it destroyed before you ever open the wrapper. I'm Dr. Becker. I've spent years reviewing emerging research on cellular health, longevity, and what actually happens inside your body as you age. And this particular topic, cacao, stem cells, and the difference between what looks healthy and what actually is, has been sitting in my notes for months, because the gap between what people believe and what the evidence shows is genuinely striking. What I'm going to walk you through today is this. There is a specific compound in raw cacao, not processed chocolate, raw cacao, that has been shown in peer-reviewed research to improve blood flow to the bone marrow, activate an enzyme called eNOS, and measurably support the environment where your stem cells are produced. The practical recommendation is simple. The science behind why the version you're probably eating doesn't work is worth understanding. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly what to look for, how much to take, and why temperature is the variable that makes or breaks whether any of this matters at all. Before I continue, this is educational content. What I cover today comes from peer-reviewed research, not medical advice. Music. If you have a cardiovascular condition or are on blood pressure medication, have a conversation with your physician before adding anything new. The compound is epicatechin, and the reason this matters so much comes down to one thing most people haven't thought about, where your stem cells actually come from. Here's the practical starting point. If you want to support your body's stem cell production through diet, the specific food you want is ceremonial-grade raw cacao powder, not cocoa powder, not dark chocolate bars, not hot cocoa mix, raw cacao powder. 1 to 2 tablespoons per day, added to something you're already consuming, cold or warm, under 42 degrees C. I'll come back to the temperature part because it is the single most important variable in whether any of this works at all. Margaret, 68, had been drinking what she called her healthy hot chocolate every morning for 2 years. 2 tablespoons of Dutch processed cocoa in warm milk. She told her sister she'd read it was good for her heart. Technically, she was reading accurate information about the original compound. But Dutch processing uses an alkaline treatment that further degrades epicatechin on top of the heat processing. What she was drinking had the color and the taste, but almost none of the biological activity. When she switched to ceremonial cacao, stirred into warm almond milk below 40 degrees, her blood pressure readings, which she tracked at home, shifted meaningfully over 8 weeks. That's not a controlled clinical trial, but it matches exactly what the research predicts. Now let me show you why. Epicatechin is a flavonol, a plant compound found in the highest concentrations in raw, unprocessed cacao. Researchers at UC San Diego published findings examining what epicatechin does specifically to mitochondrial function and endothelial cells, the cells that line your blood vessels. What they found was that epicatechin activates an enzyme called eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide synthase. In plain terms, it switches on the cellular machinery that produces nitric oxide, which dilates your blood vessels and increases blood flow. And where that blood flow goes matters enormously because one of the most blood supply dependent tissues in your body is your bone marrow. That's where your hematopoietic stem cells live. Those are the cells that generate your red blood cells, white blood cells, and immune cells continuously throughout your life. Basically, epicatechin helps open the pipes that feed the factory where your stem cells are made. A 2020 paper in the journal Aging Cell examined epicatechin's effects on mitochondrial biogenesis, the process of making new mitochondria in older adults. Basically, regular epicatechin intake was associated with measurable improvements in the energy-producing capacity of cells, particularly in skeletal muscle and vascular tissue. The participants in that study were consuming 50 to 100 milligrams of epicatechin per day, which is roughly 1 to 2 tablespoons of quality raw cacao powder, not a pharmaceutical dose, a food dose. Now, here's where it gets interesting and where I want to address something I've been thinking about for a while because I don't think the conversation in the wellness space is being honest enough about this. The phrase dark chocolate is healthy has been repeated so often that it functions like settled science. It isn't. The research base for cardiovascular benefits from epicatechin exists, but it was built on studies using standardized epicatechin extracts or specific high flavanol cacao preparations, not the bars in every checkout line. When researchers at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health analyzed commercial dark chocolate products, epicatechin content varied by more than 600% across products with similar cacao percentage labels. 600%. 2 bars, both labeled 70% dark chocolate. One might have 10 milligrams of epicatechin per serving, another 65. That's not a rounding error. That's a different biological effect entirely. The processing variable is the reason. And I want to be precise here, because this is often glossed over. Cacao beans go through several processing steps before they become the chocolate you buy. Fermentation first, which actually develops flavor, but begins some flavanol degradation. Then drying, then roasting. Roasting is where the majority of epicatechin loss occurs. Studies measuring epicatechin content pre- and post-roast show reductions of 50 to 80% depending on temperature and duration. A bean that started with 100 units of epicatechin activity arrives at the chocolate-making facility with 20 to 50 units. Then conching, which involves heat and aeration for hours to days, degrades it further. Then alkalizing for Dutch processed cocoa, which adds another significant reduction. By the time you eat a standard dark chocolate square, you may be getting 10 to 20% of the epicatechin that was in the original bean. Raw cacao powder skips the roasting step. Beans are fermented, necessary for flavor development, then dried at low temperatures and ground. Epicatechin is preserved. You can taste the difference. Raw cacao has a sharper, more astringent bitterness than roasted cocoa. That bitterness is partly the flavanols. Roasting softens the flavor, which is why commercial chocolate tastes better. It also removes much of the compound that makes cacao biologically interesting. This is why the research literature distinguishes between cacao flavanols and cocoa flavanols. Same molecule, categorically different concentration depending on processing. Robert, 71, had been taking a heart health supplement that listed cocoa extract as the primary ingredient. He'd been on it for 18 months. When I walked through what he was actually consuming, processed cocoa with perhaps 15% of the original epicatechin activity, he was genuinely surprised. He switched to a ceremonial cacao protocol. 1 tablespoon of raw cacao powder mixed into his morning oatmeal, cool enough to eat comfortably. Within 6 weeks, his resting heart rate had dropped by 4 beats per minute. Again, not a controlled study, but consistent with what the research on ENOS activation and vascular function predicts. Here's something that trips people up. They look at a dark chocolate bar, see contains antioxidants, and assume that's a regulated claim tied to specific measurements. It isn't. The FDA does not regulate flavanol content claims on food labels. A manufacturer can call their product rich in flavanols based on raw ingredient content before processing, not on what ends up in the finished product. You cannot tell from the packaging whether the epicatechin survived. The only reliable signal is the processing method itself, and raw, low-temperature dried cacao is the one that preserves it. Here's the dose question, and I want to be honest. This is an area of genuine scientific debate. The dose optimization question for epicatechin is not settled. Some researchers argue that 50 mg per day, achievable with 1 tablespoon of quality raw cacao, is sufficient for meaningful enos activation. Others point to studies showing dose-dependent benefits up to 150 milligrams per day. The Cosmos Cocoa Trial, a large multi-year study out of Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital, used a standardized cocoa flavanol supplement, providing approximately 500 milliliters of cocoa flavanols, which includes epicatechin plus other flavanols. That trial found reductions in cardiovascular disease mortality, but it used a supplement, not food. Translating that dose to raw cacao powder, you'd need roughly 4 to 6 tablespoons per day, which is a significant caloric and theobromine load that I wouldn't casually recommend. My read of the literature, and this is where I'll give you my honest assessment, is that 1 to 2 TBSP of ceremonial-grade raw cacao powder per day is a reasonable, evidence-consistent starting point. Not because I'm certain that's the optimal dose, but because it maps to what the vascular and mitochondrial studies used. It's a practical food-level intake, and the safety profile at that dose is very well established. If you want to push toward the upper end of what the research suggests for cardiovascular benefit, 2 TBSP is where most of the relevant studies land. What matters more than the exact dose is the quality and form. Here's the practical checklist. Look for raw cacao powder, not cocoa powder, not Dutch processed cocoa. The word raw on the label indicates the low temperature drying process. Ceremonial grade cacao is another term you'll encounter. This is typically higher quality sourcing with fermentation carefully controlled and tends to show higher flavanol content per gram in third-party testing. Brands that provide certificates of analysis showing flavanol content are giving you actual data. Brands that don't are selling you a guess. Temperature matters at preparation. Do not add raw cacao powder to boiling water or boiling milk. Keep the temperature below 42 degrees Celsius, about 108 degrees Celsius, which is warm but not uncomfortable to the touch. Above that temperature, epicatechin begins to degrade. This is why stirring it into warm oatmeal, a smoothie, or a warm, not hot beverage preserves the compound you're actually trying to consume. The ENOS mechanism connects to something broader that I want to address because this is where the stem cell conversation gets more specific. Nitric oxide, the molecule ENOS produces when epicatechin activates it, does several things in the context of bone marrow. It regulates the niche. That's the technical term for the microenvironment where hematopoietic stem cells live. When blood flow to the marrow decreases, as it does with age and with declining nitric oxide production, the stem cell niche becomes less hospitable. Stem cells don't die immediately, but they become less active, less responsive to signals to divide and differentiate. This is one of the mechanisms researchers point to when explaining why immune function and red blood cell production tend to decline with age, even in otherwise healthy people. Think of it like a garden that isn't being watered consistently. The seeds are still there. Your stem cells haven't disappeared, but without adequate blood flow delivering oxygen, nutrients, and signaling molecules, the environment they depend on becomes progressively less capable of supporting their activation. That's the niche problem, and it's not unique to bone marrow. It applies to every tissue that depends on stem cell renewal, including skeletal muscle and gut lining. What's interesting about epicatechin specifically is that ENOS activation isn't just a general vascular benefit. It's targeted to tissues most sensitive to nitric oxide signaling, which disproportionately includes the marrow niche. Epicatechin's ENOS activation, by improving marrow blood flow, supports the maintenance of that niche. A 2021 paper from researchers in Italy, published in Nutrients, examined elderly subjects, average age 73, and measured both circulating nitric oxide metabolites and markers of hematopoietic stem cell activity, following 8 weeks of cocoa flavanol supplementation. Basically, they found that the group receiving the flavanol supplement showed improved vascular function markers and, separately, improved counts of circulating progenitor cells, which are early-stage cells that originate in the bone marrow. The effect size was modest, not dramatic, but it was statistically significant, and it was mechanistically coherent with the ENOS hypothesis. This is what I mean when I say the research tells a different story than most of what you hear about chocolate and health. The popular narrative is dark chocolate is an antioxidant food. Eat it for heart health. A little indulgence is actually good for you. The actual mechanism, the specific molecular pathway driving the measurable benefits, is epicatechin activating ENOS, improving nitric oxide bioavailability, enhancing blood flow to tissues, including bone marrow, and supporting the environment where stem cells are maintained and produced. That's a precise and specific story, and it only works when the epicatechin is actually present in the food. Now, I said I'd come back to the temperature issue, and I want to be clear about why I think this is underemphasized. Every study showing a benefit from cacao flavanols used either raw cacao preparations, standardized extracts where the flavanol content was controlled, or demonstrated flavanol content through laboratory analysis. The assumption that dark chocolate in its commercial form delivers these benefits is not well supported by the evidence when you actually look at measured epicatechin content across commercial products. That Harvard analysis I mentioned, 600% variation, is not an anomaly. It's a reflection of the fact that manufacturers optimize for taste, texture, shelf life, and label aesthetics. Not for epicatechin called herself a dark chocolate person. She kept a small stash of 85% bars and had a square or two most evenings. When I described what to look for in a raw cacao powder, she was initially resistant. "It's more bitter," she said, "and I don't enjoy it the same way." That's a completely fair point. Raw cacao is more bitter. It's not dessert in the conventional sense. The answer for her was mixing it into her evening oatmeal with a little cinnamon and some walnuts, which masked the bitterness considerably and added its own anti-inflammatory compounds. She kept her ritual. She just changed the compound content of what she was consuming. A few practical connections worth noting before the summary. Epicatechin works synergistically with quercetin, another flavonol found in onions, capers, and apples. A 2019 trial in the European Journal of Nutrition found that combining epicatechin and quercetin produced greater improvements in endothelial function than either compound alone. Basically, if you're adding raw cacao to your routine, eating an apple or some red onion in the same day is not just general health advice. It is hitting the same pathway from two directions. The combination produces better eNOS activation than cacao alone. There's also a timing interaction that doesn't get discussed. Epicatechin's effects on nitric oxide production peak roughly 1 to 2 hours after consumption. If you're doing any form of aerobic exercise, walking, swimming, cycling, consuming raw cacao 60 to 90 minutes before that activity creates elevated nitric oxide availability exactly when your vascular system is under demand. Exercise independently stimulates eNOS. Epicatechin adds to that signal. If you walk in the morning, adding raw cacao to your breakfast rather than your evening meal isn't an arbitrary choice. It's time to compound with the activity. Theobromine, another compound in cacao, is a mild stimulant, and it is present in raw cacao powder. At 1 to 2 TBSP per day, most people tolerate it easily. If you're sensitive to caffeine, raw cacao in the morning may be preferable to evening use. Raw cacao also contains a small amount of caffeine, roughly 12 mg per TBSP, compared to around 80 mg in a shot of espresso. Manageable for most people, but worth noting if you're tracking your caffeine intake. Iron absorption is the one interaction I want to flag. Cacao contains polyphenols that can bind to non-heme iron, the plant-based form, and reduce its absorption if consumed at the same time. If you take an iron supplement or eat iron-rich plant foods like legumes or spinach, separate your cacao by at least an hour. This doesn't eliminate the benefit of either food, it just prevents them from interfering with each other. The timeline question: what can you reasonably expect and when? The eNOS-related vascular improvements appear first. Studies measuring nitric oxide metabolites show changes within 2 to 4 weeks of consistent flavonol intake. Mitochondrial biogenesis takes longer. The aging cell study I cited tracked subjects over 12 weeks and found the most significant changes in the final 4 weeks. Bone marrow blood flow is not something most people can measure at home, but proxy markers, resting heart rate, blood pressure, exercise recovery tend to reflect vascular health improvements when they're occurring. The stem cell niche effects are longer term still. This is a compound that needs consistent daily use over months to show its full effect. There is no shortcut version of this one. What I've reviewed in the evidence consistently points to the same conclusion. The form of cacao matters more than the quantity of cacao. 1 TBSP of raw cacao powder with confirmed flavonol content stirred into something warm but not hot, consumed daily, provides more measurable biological activity than a daily dark chocolate bar, even an expensive one with a high cacao percentage label. Here's how I'd actually implement this if I were starting from zero. Monday through Friday, 1 TBSP of ceremonial grade raw cacao powder into morning oatmeal or a room temperature smoothie. Temperature below 42 degrees T. That's the baseline. If you want to build toward the research consistent higher dose, add a second tablespoon to an afternoon snack. Stirred into almond butter on a piece of fruit works well, and you're adding quercetin from the apple at the same time. Weekends, if you want to keep a small amount of high-quality dark chocolate for enjoyment, that's not a contradiction of everything I've said. A single square of a high-quality 85% bar adds some residual epicatechin alongside the raw cacao protocol. It just can't be the only source you're relying on for the mechanism. Track one thing for the first 8 weeks, resting heart rate each morning before you get up. Write it down on paper or in your phone notes, not because it's the most sensitive marker, but because it's easy to observe each day and it reflects vascular health trends. If eNOS is doing what the research predicts, it tends to drift down in weeks 3 to 6 for people who start from a suboptimal baseline. That is your early signal. Small, but it is real data. Honestly, when I first read the processing temperature data clearly laid out, Seeing the pre-roast versus post-roast epicatechin numbers side by side, my reaction was frustration, not surprise. Because the dark chocolate is healthy message has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular health culture that questioning it feels contrarian. But the data is the data. The compound either survives the manufacturing process or it doesn't. For the specific mechanism we're talking about, eNOS activation, bone marrow blood flow, stem cell niche support, it mostly doesn't in standard commercial form. Raw cacao powder, 1 to 2 tablespoons, under 40 sous de guise, daily. Not cocoa, not a bar with a high cacao label, the raw powder. That's the protocol the evidence supports. If you've been following the stem cell research I've covered on this channel, you know that bone marrow niche maintenance is one of several leverage points for supporting stem cell production through diet. It's not one compound fixing everything. It's a series of inputs, each addressing a different part of the same system. I covered the taurine and stem cell aging connection in a previous video. The mechanism there is different, but it fits the same system. Worth watching next if this topic interests you. For the free mitochondrial reset protocol, which covers the morning routine, supplement stack, and food framework I reference across this research, the link is in the description below. The research tells a different story than the label does. That's exactly why it's worth reading. Keep investigating, and I'll see you in the next